Well, Laurie, thank you very much indeed. And ladies and gentlemen, thank you all for coming. It's wonderful to see you all here. I'm going to begin, if I may, with a little story that seems apt to our present discontents. The year is 1945. We're in the Palace of Westminster. Clement Attlee is the Labour Prime Minister. And one day he's in the gents in the House of Commons, relieving himself. The door swings open and it's the leader of the opposition, Sir Winston Churchill. Churchill spies Attlee at the urinal and he walks purposefully down to the farthest end. Attlee says, feeling a bit standoffish today, are we, Winston? And Churchill, majestically unbuttoning his fly, replies, no, but whenever you see anything big, Clement, you nationalise it. I say that is apt to our present discontents because we now have a Prime Minister who has spent more on nationalisation than even Clement Attlee did at the height of the post-war seizure of the old industries. And to fund this nationalisation, he has run up a bigger debt than Winston Churchill incurred to win the Second World War with the rather obvious distinction, my friends, that we haven't just been fighting the Second World War. We have, if anything, been busily engaged in handing away the freedoms that our fathers defended, above all the freedom to live under our own laws and our own people in our own sovereign parliament. I begin with that example, not to depress you, but to ask you to ponder our example and tremble. We are on the same road that you have just embarked on, but we started 11 years ago. And if you see the point we've reached, you see a grisly picture of your own future. Britain, as it stands now, has emptied its treasury, exhausted its credit. It stands diminished and dishonoured among nations. I say this as a friend of your country, as an admirer of the United States. Do not make the same mistakes that we've made. You don't even have the excuse that we had that you didn't have somebody else's example to avoid, right? We have now taken that excuse away from you. Now, before I say anything else, it is a real pleasure for me to stand up, first of all, and to thank Laurie, who has been not only a brilliant organiser of what I'm doing, has been a really good friend. And I want to say what a fantastic organisation Regular Folks, which she runs, is. And it's exactly what it says. It does exactly what it purports to. If there's one thing I've learnt in politics, it's always to repose your confidence in the regular folks rather than in the people who purport to speak to them. I remember when I was 15 years old, possibly the single most politically important moment of my teenage years. There's a British philosopher called Roger Scruton, incredibly clever man, who unusually is both a successful philosopher and a right-wing conservative. And he came to speak at my school philosophy society. And I remember at the end I said to him, Professor, what would you say is the role of a conservative thinker in the modern world? And he thought about it and he blinked diffidently behind his spectacles and he said, the role of a conservative thinker is to reassure the people that their prejudices are true. And if there is a better definition than that, I have yet to hear it. And basically, that is the purpose of an organisation like Regular Folks United. You speak for all the decent people, the hard-working people, the family people, the people who stick up for themselves, don't always go whining to the government for solutions, try and look after their neighbours rather than expecting the state to do it for them, and who now feel, with justice, ripped off and lied to and taken for granted and ignored and overtaxed and overregulated and angry. And somebody ought to speak for them. The man who perhaps best expressed the difference between the regular folks and the politician was the grandfather of British conservatism, Edmund Burke. Wonderful metaphor he drew, which will be familiar to some of you, and it's one of my favourite lines of Edmund Burke. He said, because half a dozen grasshoppers, concealed under the fern, make the field ring with their importunate chink, while thousands of great cattle take their repose under the shade of the British oak and are silent. Pray do not imagine that those who make all the noise are the only inhabitants of the field. And that, it seems to me, is where we are in your country and in mine. There is a repository of good sense in the population that finds little articulation among the political caste. I was asked here to give a British response to the Tea Parties. Now, of course, the first problem you have is that in most of the media, these Tea Parties haven't happened. So I had to Google around quite desperately to find out what it was that people were talking about. Then eventually I found some references to them in the mainstream media, and I discovered that it was a sort of fringe gathering of racist fruitcakes and rednecks and, you know. And, I read history, and you know what immediately occurred to me? That, mutatis mutandis, that was what they said about the original Tea Party in Boston. Oh, they're these unrepresentative madmen. You know, it's all been got up by Sam Adams, and he's hired these kind of unemployable louts and these sort of thuggish, drunken longshoremen and a couple of Mohican Indians, right? And you know what? We now know better. We now know that the objectives of the people responsible for the original Tea Party were shared by a nation. And the state that was drawn up and founded by their successors was founded on those principles, and I believe those principles are still shared by most Americans. And let's just remind ourselves of what the protesters at the original Boston Tea Party were pushing for. They believed that the concentration of power led to corruption and malfeasance. They wanted jurisdiction to be dispersed. They wanted decisions to be taken as closely as possible to the people that they affect. They believed that laws should not be passed but with popular consent, that taxes should not be levied except by elected representatives, and that the executive should be answerable to the legislature. Now, unless I've completely misunderstood it, that is exactly what their successors in the existing Tea Party demonstrations and in Regular Folks United and in some of the other organisations represented in this room are pushing for. How extraordinary at this stage that you should be having to have this same argument again when your nation was founded out of a revolt, a popular uprising against a remote and undemocratic government, and when these precepts of devolved and dispersed power should have been written into the way your whole political structure developed. You might find it slightly odd that I come here as a British politician and hymn the virtues of the original colonial patriot leaders and the people who founded your state and wrote your constitution. Let me explain why I do so. First of all, some of you are going to be shocked by this, and some of you will be offended by it, but I'm going to say it anyway. If you disregard some of the flag-waving histories written about the Independence War subsequently, and you go back to what your patriot leaders were saying at the time, you'll find a very interesting thing. You find two very interesting things. First of all, most of the grievances of the colonial leaders in America were shared by a majority of the British population. Now, this didn't find expression through the political institutions of the United Kingdom because we didn't have anything approaching a universal franchise in those days. But if you look at the things you can measure, such as circulation and readership of newspapers, petitions offered to Parliament, it is very clear that the proportion of people sympathetic to the patriot position in the United States was probably about the same in Great Britain as in the colonies, perhaps 2/3 of the population. And that's maybe not as surprising as it sounds for this reason. Again, disregard what you have read since and go back to what Jefferson and Franklin and Adams and Washington were saying at the time in the run-up to the fighting. They didn't see themselves as revolutionaries. They saw themselves as conservatives.